Hi everyone, this is Jessica Fortmiller. Tonight I'm going to be presenting my case study for Professor Difato's online international course on comparative politics. I'm going to be doing my case study on Iran. So to start off with, I'm just going to cover some really basic details. Iran is a theocratic state. Population is about 78 million people. Your average citizen is about 27.8 years old, so as you can imagine, it's a pretty young adult population. The descendants are mostly Persian. They do speak Persian, which is synonymous with Farsi, and that's what you're most likely to hear in the Western world. The majority of the religious population is going to be Muslim, about 98% of the country. The majority of that is going to be Shia Muslim. It's a fairly modern and advanced society, and we'll kind of cover that on a later slide. And we are going to discuss the shift in government institutions. Back in the Iranian Revolution of 1979, they did go from a more secularized institution to the theocratic state that we know it as today. Okay, so to start off with some brief history, in the early 20th century, you do start with the Great Game, which is in 1907. It's kind of just basically a power struggle between Russia and the UK for territory in Central Asia, part of which Iran, which was known as Persia at the time, got in the middle of. When Germany began to gain a foothold in the Middle East, the Brits and Russians band together in order to effectively limit Germany's power. So therefore, they split Persia into three zones. The Brits took over the south, Russia took over the north, and then there was a neutral buffer zone in between. So it kind of gives you an idea of the influences that were coming into play early on. So while the Great Game was going on, we also had the Constitutional Revolution, which took place between 1905 and 1911. Basically what was happening was the current Shah at that time, Nasir ad-Din Shah, was a ruler and a dictator, and he introduced many secular practices to what was then Persia, including telegraphy and post offices. A lot of civil unrest that ensued when the Shah tried to make local bazaar sellers lower their cost of their goods. It was when things became violent that the protesters demanded the formation of a House of Justice, and soon a constitutional monarchy was born, and with it the Constitution. So 14 years later, we're still experiencing a lot of unrest in Persia, and that's when Reza Khan Pahlavi led a coup d'etat in Tehran. And with that, he had a desire to kind of form some national unity within the country, and he started by asking that the Western countries refer to it as Iran, which was its ancient name to its ancestors, and that is why we now know it as. So when Reza Khan became the Shah of the Pahlavi dynasty, saw a lot of things happening there. For one thing, we had the establishment of the Trans-Iranian Railroad. Also had some reforms in educational practices, resulting in the building of the Tehran University. Later on, when World War II broke out, the Allies decided that the Shah was getting a little bit too close for comfort with the Germans, so they abdicated him and made sure that his young son, the studly young man, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, became the next Shah. So in 1941, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi became the official Shah of Iran at the tender age of 22. And then, in 1963, we experienced the White Revolution in Iran, which was basically just a push for secularization yet again in the country. So that included things like reform, private sector purchases. There was a thing that was established called the Literacy Corps to combat the illiteracy rates within the country. And the biggest thing, if not the most upsetting thing, was the fact that the Shah gave women the right to vote, also gave them rights in child custody as well as in divorce. So this obviously did not sit very well with the Iranian clergy, one of which included Ayatollah Khomeini, who then led the Iranian Revolution of 1979. He began dispersing his message about an Islamic state through music cassettes that were smuggled into the country. It was at that point that the opposition became so strong against the Shah that in January of 1979 he fled the country. So then what we saw was a large number of supporters for the Shah being executed. There was a large amount of violence in the country. And it was then at that point, on April 1st, just 3 months after the Shah had left, that a national referendum was called, and Khomeini declared Iran an Islamic republic, and he established a new constitution reflecting the ideals of Islam, and that is how we now know it as the theocracy. So now that we've covered some of the more basic details of the history of Iran, we're going to go over some of the stuff that plagues the country today, in addition to women's rights yet again, the nuclear deals that have been going on, as well as the conversations that have been going on between President Obama and the recent president, President Rouhani. So to start off with, for the political regime, we have President Hassan Rouhani, who was recently elected just this year in 2013. Although I put him on the first slide, he is the second highest ranking official, and I'll kind of explain why on a later slide. He is responsible for economic matters, foreign and diplomatic policy. So in contrast to the U.S., he's not responsible for as much as the United States president, especially controlling the military, subordinate to the supreme leader, and he's considered a moderate and a centrist, just basically based on the women's rights that he's been trying to push for recently, and he is trying to resolve some nuclear weapons matters. And this is Ayatollah Khamenei, different from the former Ayatollah Khomeini. This is the supreme leader that I mentioned before. He's basically solely responsible for everything that goes on in the government of Iran. He's the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. He can declare war or peace. He can also dismiss or appoint members of the judiciary. So below Ayatollah Khamenei is the Council of Guardians. So we've got 12 jurists on the judiciary branch, 6 of which are elected by the supreme leader. So kind of think of them as the United States Congress. They're responsible for interpreting the Constitution and its adherence to Sharia law. So typically what happens is if Parliament tries to pass a bill, 40% of the time it ends up getting kicked back. So they're almost solely responsible for checks and balances, and the chairman is pictured here. That is Ayatollah Ahmad Janati. To continue further, we have the Parliament. That's the unicameral legislative body of about 280 members. They are publicly elected every 4 years, and the Parliament is known for having some pretty heated debates. They draft legislation, they ratify international treaties, as well as govern the budget. They do have the authority to approve or reject nominees to the President's cabinet. However, they are, again, subordinate to not only the President, but also to the Council of Guardians and the Supreme Leaders. The interesting thing to note about the Parliament is that a lot of issues tend to go unresolved, or it takes a little bit longer than normal because it does lack conventional political parties. They do, however, make opportunities for diversity to be felt. They do designate 5 seats for religious minorities, so that includes your Jews, Christians, Zoroastrians. So moving on to the political identity, there are several recognized ethnicities. The early ancestors, known as the Indo-Iranians, that are pictured in the top left corner, they came down from Central Asia, coming down south. Included some of the list of minority tribes that are located in Iran. If you'll notice, the map here in the center kind of depicts those tribes on the outskirts of the state. The majority, again, is going to be of Aryan descent, so your Persians. The country of Iran itself houses the second largest population of Afghan refugees. When I looked into it further, the reason being is obviously Afghanistan borders Iran, and part of the reason that they're experiencing so many issues at this current time is just with the U.S. sanctions on the nuclear systems or deals in Iran have kind of led to some issues with unemployment rates and inflation, which is really causing the Iranian government to come down hard on the Afghan population. So on that note, in terms of religion's blurred lines in the country, as I said before earlier, primarily it's Shia Muslim, which is 89% of the population. There is much respect held for the Jewish population in the country. It happens to be the second largest Jewish population in the world there in Iran. The only issue being that although there is some representation in the government for different groups such as the Christians, Jews, and the Zoroastrians, the problem is that in the Iran Constitution, in Article 4, it states that all facets of life must exemplify the Islamic faith. So those that do not. And one of the reasons that I put struggles to modernize the Islamic State at the bottom of this slide is simply because it seems to me that the political identity is somewhat ambiguous in Iran at the current time. As I mentioned before, the population is mostly young adults, and a lot of them, although wanting to preserve their Sharia law, their Islamic fundamentals, the only problem being that they are striving more nowadays for human rights and women. So to delve a little bit further into the political identity aspect of our case study, I wanted to kind of go over gender. I know I mentioned that women's rights has been a hot button issue recently in Iran. Iran is a patriarchal society, basically just meaning that the father is the authority figure. Women possess very few civil rights. For example, you can have a professional job, however, your male counterparts tend to be paid more than you. Um, you're expected to cover your hair. You can't work if your husband won't allow you to, and you can also still endure domestic abuse. Part of the reason that Iran is so strict on women's rights and keeping them contained is because they believe that a state's discipline of women is a measure of the state's own goodness. So in 1979, right around the time of the Iranian Revolution, is when they started to ask women to voluntarily take up the chador, which is a lot like the hijab, the head cover, only the chador is a full. And not only do women face a lot of scrutiny, but they also face the potential to be punished, if not abused, for their decisions to stand up for their own rights. For example, in 2004, Amena Barami had turned down a suitor's proposal, and in return he threw acid in her face. So it was a 5-year-long process in order to put into place a kisa, which basically means eye for an eye, retribution in Sharia law. However, in 2009, when they were going to place poison in the man's eyes, Barami insisted that they just. And so, your typical woman from the United States might find that to be a real act of bravery, but also very appalling to find that some women have to face such atrocities in their own country just for small rights as their right to vote or equality and things of that nature. Another example was in 2009, the Green Movement. That was a political movement to remove Mahmoud Ahmadinejad from office. That was the president back in 2009. This group was very pro-reform, very nationalistic. Moderate Islamism is what they condoned. So there was a huge population of protesters. They say that it was almost as large as the protesting population during the Iranian Revolution. And those individuals were also felt very strongly about supporting women's rights. And the final point on the slide is in 2013, as I've told you before, President Rouhani was elected into office, and he has also made a push for women's rights recently, much to the concern of the Iranian clergy. He has tried to put in place what will be known as the Women's Affairs Ministry, which will fight just for women's equality, their voting rights, things of that nature. However, the Parliament has said, or excuse me, the Council of Guardians has said that they can still imprison women for supporting this ministry, just because they believe the fight for women's rights to be impeding on national security. So that's still kind of an issue going on right now. So this brings me to my final slide. So what is next for the Iranian government and its economy? I will say one of the most recent things I've read about is the sanctions that have been placed on the Iranian economy as far as nuclear weapons is concerned, as well as their petroleum sales. I read in New York Times that as a result of Iran's support for international terrorism and its aggressive actions against non-belligerent shipping in the Persian Gulf, we have placed firm restrictions on who they sell to and who of our allies can make sales to them. So that's affected the Iranian petroleum trading a lot. 80% of the economy relies on that oil. So a lot of major trading partners like China are starting to limit those dealings based on U.S. sanctions. So it's really bringing the Iranian economy. So President Rouhani has tried to make some kind of negotiations on the nuclear facilities in Iran to hopefully maybe lift some of those sanctions or alleviate them in order to keep their economy from taking a complete nosedive. But he does say change will not come overnight. So this concludes my presentation. I hope you all enjoyed. Please have a happy Thanksgiving, and thank you so much for listening.